Okay. Senator Urquhart.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the debate on the Clean Energy Legislation Carbon Tax Repeal Bill 2013, and with my colleagues on this side, will not be supporting this bill. This suite of bills sets Australia up to fail on our climate change obligations, to fail our children and our grandchildren, and to fail millions of people facing displacement from the effects of climate change. These repeal bills seek to set Australia up to do less to combat climate change. These bills seek to leave the heavy lifting of decarbonising our economy to future generations. There is a strong foundation of scientific fact underpinning the need to reduce global emissions, to reduce the risk of global warming above 2 degrees. So certain, in fact, that doubt has crept in. With 95% certainty that greenhouse gas emissions from humans are caused by global warming, some cast doubt and say, what about the 5%? If you were 95% certain that something bad, that something nasty was going to happen to you or your family, would you sit by and say, what about the 5%? Or would you find out what was causing the problem and get about fixing it? Well, we're not too late to fix the problem of climate change, but time is running out fast. Late last year, I participated in the Senate's Environment and Communications Legislation Committee's inquiry into these repeal bills. The new coalition government referred these repeal bills to the committee to examine the costs of pricing carbon on households and businesses. While the opposition referred these bills on the basis of examining how they fitted with Australia's long-term climate change obligations. Put simply, we started from and continue to see this problem through very different lenses. On one side, the new coalition government see climate change in terms of purely the here and now. The arguments from those opposite revolve around immediate costs for business, but fail to mention the jobs and competitiveness package that was embraced by so many businesses who saw an opportunity to invest in energy-efficient technology or in renewables or in low-emissions technology to give their business the competitive edge. Their arguments are that the immediate costs for households are too high, but they fail to recognise that the carbon price was offset through tax cuts and increases to welfare payments to 9 out of 10 households. On our side, we see the problem in terms of the medium to long term. As important as any 2020 target is the need to have in place a price mechanism for emissions reduction beyond 2020, with targets for reductions at 2030 and 2050. It's not just about the here and now. It's about the kind of Australia, the world we want to leave for our future generations. Just last week, the Climate Change Authority reiterated its calls for an increase in the emissions reduction target to 2020, recognising that emissions reductions made now are less costly in the longer term. Labor's approach to reducing emissions is to repeal the carbon tax and keep in place the already legislated emissions trading scheme, which puts a legal cap on carbon pollution. This lets business work out the cheapest and most effective ways to operate within that cap. Cap and trade is overwhelmingly endorsed by economists as the most cost-effective and efficient emissions reduction method. The OECD recently confirmed that higher levels of emissions reductions can be achieved at much lower cost through a carbon market mechanism. Carbon pricing is cheaper and more efficient than direct subsidies without a pricing signal. The first 18 months of the carbon price has seen emissions from electricity fall, with coal power generation down and renewable energy generation up. The carbon price is not the sole reason for these changes, nor has it been insignificant. As such, the carbon price has been effective in increasing the competitiveness of renewable energy generation. Meanwhile, Australia's economy grew at trend in 2012-2013, while additional government assistance to households has more than offset any price rises caused by the carbon price. The binding caps will ensure Australia meets its international emissions reduction targets under the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol of 2013 to 2020 and under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Targets with which 99 countries covering 80% of global emissions and including all of the major emitters have pledged to reduce or limit emissions by 2020. The flexible price would bring the Australian carbon price into line with the carbon price prevailing under the European Union emission trading scheme, which is currently expected to be around $6 per tonne of emissions. Moving to flexible price emissions trading would ensure Australia meets its international emissions reduction commitments, while we also reduce compliance and transaction costs for businesses, increase flexibility and improve risk management. Importantly, embedding a carbon price in our economy sets Australia up on a long-term trajectory for emissions reduction. Slow decreases in the cap on pollution over a long period of time gives businesses and households certainty and limits risk of a carbon shock in future years, a carbon shock that will hit households and businesses far harder than a responsibly introduced carbon price. Direct action subsidies with a finite duration do no such thing, and the new coalition government is fully aware of this. These bills have left many across the world wondering, is the new Australian government serious about reducing emissions? After all, it was just a few years ago that the new Prime Minister famously dismissed climate change science as absolute crap to a small crowd in rural Victoria. Based on the coalition government's policies, Australia's rating on Climate Change Performance Index has dropped to 57 out of 61 countries. Embarrassingly, at last year's Warsaw Climate Change Conference, Australia received 4 of the 5 Fossil of the Day awards. These awards recognise the coalition government's backward proposal to wind back the carbon price mechanism and abandon support for research and clean energy. It's clear that this current Senate will not pass this suite of bills as they stand. So what of the next Senate? Interestingly, in Tasmania, the Liberal opposition election spokesperson Vanessa Goodwin is questioning the Palmer United Party's stance on abolishing the price on carbon, and I quote, "Mr Palmer has refused to pay his $8 million carbon tax bill, including penalties, and now he is aiming to win the balance of power in the Senate so that his senators will vote to backdate the abolition of the tax, so Mr Palmer doesn't have to pay it." Will those opposite cede to Mr Palmer's demands? What is the cost on the Australian budget if those opposite abolish the carbon price and refund all payments made over the past 2 years? Clearly, they will rely on the Palmer United Party senators to pass this legislation. Legislation that has been discussed for months sets Australia up to fail. In its latest report on climate change policies, the OECD has highlighted that those serious about tackling climate change are implementing a price on carbon. For Australia to have a carbon pricing mechanism in place and remove it means we are turning our back on the world. China, long held up by the coalition as not acting, is implementing 7 carbon pricing trials, and in one its carbon price has surged higher than Europe's. Guangdong province, China's largest with a population of more than 100 million, introduced a capped greenhouse gas emissions and issued carbon permits to big polluters from December 10 last year. Emissions trading schemes were also introduced in Beijing, Shanghai and Shenzhen provinces last year. As we participate in this debate to remove Australia's carbon pricing mechanism, China is getting on with implementing carbon pricing policies to see its economy through the decades the carbon pricing policies to see its economy through the carbon restraints designed to occur across coming decades. Yes, China's starting price is lower than Australia's, but there were amendments on the table in the House of Representatives to reduce our price, and the new coalition government didn't even allow them to be debated. As our new coalition government seeks to send Australia backwards, China recognises the impacts of pollution upon its economy, upon its society, and is putting in place the long-term policies to deal with it. The President of the United States of America has outlined his desire for a national market-based solution to climate change. He acknowledged that it would not pass the current Congress and has moved anyway to introduce stronger regulations. It's interesting the similarities between the Republican Tea Party and the climate deniers in the new coalition government, and the opportunism to some of those in the coalition to use President Obama's remarks that emissions trading won't pass Congress and that America will increase its efforts through regulation as justification that emissions trading is not being implemented across the world. Australia is fortunate that there is a carbon pricing mechanism in place, so the coin is flipped the other way in this place. Dr France Josto, a leading climate change academic at the Australian National University, highlighted the clear benefits to the Australian economy of using a carbon price mechanism to tackle climate change in his submission to the Senate inquiry. And I quote, "The carbon pricing mechanism currently in place is an economically sound basis for climate change mitigation policy in Australia. Repealing Australia's clean energy legislation and related bills is undesirable if a lasting policy framework for greenhouse gas emissions reductions is to be established, and if emissions reductions are to be achieved cost-effectively. Repeal will exacerbate policy uncertainty with adverse effects on investment." Dr Jotso was not alone in supporting the current clean energy legislation. The clear majority of submissions to the inquiry opposed the repeal bills. Mr Nathan Fabian, Chief Executive Officer of the Investor Group on Climate Change, in evidence to the inquiry said that the world is acting to reduce carbon. Mr Fabian said, and I quote, "Nations are implementing emissions reductions policies that make sense for the circumstances. In our view, it is our view that an emissions trading scheme with a cap makes sense for Australia's circumstances. That is because it is in the interest of Australian companies to be able to contribute to emissions reductions at least cost while reducing their own emissions from domestic plant and equipment over time and in a time frame that makes sense to them. It is simply not good enough for the new Australian government to throw out this well-thought-out policy, a policy that is designed to lower uncertainty for business and households, a policy that seeks to meet our international emissions reduction obligations at the least cost to jobs and our economy. The Coalition's government's repeal bills and direct action policy undermine investment certainty in renewable energy and energy efficiency measures. If there is bipartisan recognition that climate change is a serious concern and we must limit Australia's emissions, we need a long-term framework with which to provide some certainty to investors, to business, the community and other nations. The Coalition claims direct action will reduce emissions by 5% from 2000 levels by 2020. But the legislation before us does not specify a 5% reduction. The target is purely that. It is not binding. The government has insisted there will be no further expenditure across the 4-year budget. Everything is unknown until the government's review processes are finalised sometime this year. On top of that, the government has announced a review of the renewable energy target to be conducted by an individual that doesn't even believe that human-induced climate change is an issue. The renewable energy target, currently set at 20% of generation by 2020, actually acts to lower energy prices. This is because the variable cost of wind power is virtually zero, and increased wind generation reduces the nation's reliance on expensive gas generation. Despite these basic economics, there are fears in the community that the Coalition will abolish or reduce the renewable energy target, a policy that would actually increase energy prices and reduce our nation's capacity to generate renewable energy. The delays, poor legislation and RET review are clear impediments to long-term investment in the Australian renewable energy sector. The Investor Group on Climate Change suggests that it is easier and more secure to invest in countries such as Ireland, the UK and USA because of policy certainty that is in Australia now. Investors like long-term certainty with the lowest possible risk and reasonable returns. And it is not just big institutional investors that are being hit by the investment uncertainty created by the Coalition government's delays and poor policy. The 2,000 investors in the Hepburn Wind Cooperative in Victoria have had their projected returns slashed. The families who invested in the cooperative made their investment decision in around 2008-2009. Of course, at that time there was bipartisan support for a carbon price mechanism. Their earnings are expected to reduce from 4.1 cents per share in 2012-13 to 1.1 cents per share without a carbon price. So much for the open for business mantra declared by the new Prime Minister. The new Coalition government, in fact, are eyes wide shut in their approach to providing certainty to business. The new Coalition government has sought to frame this debate about the utility bills paid by households and businesses. In seeking to repeal the carbon price, The main purpose seems to be the miraculous reduction in utility bills and overall costs on households and businesses. Never mind that the rise in electricity has overwhelmingly been the fault of infrastructure upgrades to our distribution networks. Never mind that there are different prices and usages in every state. The Prime Minister was unambiguous in stating the reductions Australia can expect if these repeal bills pass, and I quote, "Thanks to this bill, household electricity bills will be $200 lower next financial year without the carbon tax. Household gas bills will be $70 lower next financial year without the carbon tax." There is evidence to suggest the coalition government has overestimated the impact of removing the carbon price on household expenses. The committee heard that households in some states could expect a greater than quoted reduction, while in others their rates or usage aren't so high the reduction would be less. While Mr Graham Wood, the Energy Director at the Grattan Institute, said to the committee that the savings generated from removing the carbon price will be less than if they would have been than when the cost was first imposed. Other prices have risen over time. The carbon price has been internationalised by business, and unpicking it in exact terms is nigh on impossible. All of this would be fine in normal debate. People would understand that the Prime Minister is debating prices in average terms and would expect some reduction. However, given this Prime Minister's penchant for absolute honesty in this debate, if the repeal bills do one day pass this place, I will be eager to learn of any research into changes in electricity and gas costs and hold him to account if his absolute guarantees are not met. And he is off, even by a few dollars. It will be another broken promise by this new coalition government. A record of broken promises that is getting longer and longer by the day. And what of promises? What of commitments? The coalition has on numerous times in both opposition and now government said it is committed to our internationally declared target of a 5% reduction on 2000 levels by 2020. However, its direct action plan is still in the draft stage, even though it has been policy since 2010. Direct action does not appear to be adequately funded through to 2020, and the Prime Minister has said that there will be no further funding. Either a promise will be broken on the level of abatement through to 2020 or the promise of no further funding. If the new coalition government is to find more funding for direct action, there is a real concern in the community that they will reallocate funding from existing environment programs or from social welfare. The Australian Council of Social Services highlighted in its submission to the inquiry that there is no real benefit for low-income Australians from 1 year of reduced power prices if the direct action is funded by reducing programs on which these people rely. Of course, programs that low-income Australians rely upon are right in the coalition's sight for termination. The school kids bonus and low-income superannuation contribution are set to be abolished. The $6 GP tax is all but certain to be included in this budget. We have the new coalition government saying that things will be better, that prices will be less, the cost of living easier, and there will be more opportunity. And yet these repeal bills do not provide guaranteed funding or guaranteed emissions, and they will carve a huge hole in our nation's budget, resulting in large cuts in funding to education, health and public services. There are no guarantees for long-term price reductions or increases in opportunity over the long term. These repeal bills are a backward step, leaving households and businesses vulnerable to a shock in future years. The necessity to act on climate change only grows stronger each year. The immediate and long-term costs of allowing warming greater than 2 degrees are the core reason for acting now with a policy suite that is designed to scale up over time. Removing this policy suite for the sake of a reduction in utility costs in one financial year, which may not actually eventuate, is not only reckless but also irresponsible. Despite the shallow rhetoric of the new coalition government that they believe in climate change and support actions, it's clear from these repeal bills that nothing could be further from the truth. If these repeal bills pass, we, the Parliament, will leave Australia with no credible emissions reduction policy. We will leave the 46th and the 47th Parliaments of Australia with much harder decisions in the future. And I've urged senators to vote no in this bill.
Thank you.